wonderful introduction. My father in particular would be very happy. And it's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm a philosopher of mind and a philosopher of science, working mainly in the areas of mind-brain science and trying to bring the mind-brain science perspective into phenomenological philosophy, and also trying to bring the phenomenological perspective into mind-brain science. And in my work, one of the things that I've been particularly interested in is the relationship between mind and environment. And that's really what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight. I want to present a number of different ideas under this theme of mind in living environments. And the introduction that Alf just gave was really perfect, because I wanted to start with a quotation from Gregory Bateson. Some of you may know his work. For those of you who don't, he was an anthropologist, cybernetician, very influential figure in the environmental movement in the 1970s. And in one of his essays, he wrote that the individual mind is immanent, but not only in the body. It is immanent also in pathways and messages outside the body. And there is a larger mind of which this individual mind is only a subsystem. By larger mind, what he had in mind here was, as he sometimes also called it, a pattern that connects the organism and environment, a pattern that itself exhibits kind of intelligence and adaptivity and self-organization. So he also wrote that the identity between the unit of mind and the unit of evolutionary survival, the organism and the environment, not simply the organism or not simply the gene, but the coupled system of organism and environment. The identity between the unit of mind and the unit of evolutionary survival is of very great importance. It means that I now localize something which I am calling mind, immanent in the large biological system, the ecosystem. So the guiding idea then, that I'm taking from these quotations as inspiration, is that the environment is not a container for mind, or a mere site where mind happens to be located, nor is mind limited to the confines of the skull. Rather, mind is a relational pattern encompassing living beings and their environments, and it thus extends beyond the skull and skin. So that's the guiding idea, and what I would like to do, the task for in my work, and also what I want to share with you, is whether we can characterize this relational pattern, or mind, in more detail. And the approach that I'm going to take builds on work that really goes back to the work of the neuroscientist Francisco Varela, now deceased, with whom I worked for a number of years. And in his work by himself, and also work we did in collaboration in the context of the brain and cognitive sciences, we proposed an approach that we called the Inactive Approach. And the basic idea is that cognition isn't the internal representation of an outside world. That's, if you like, the sort of parachute view of cognition, that you sort of drop into an environment that's already there, your mind you already possess, it is internal to you, and whether you are successful in getting around in this world or in solving the problems that it poses really has to do with whether you have a good map, whether you have a good set of internal mental representations. That's a standard representationalist view. So we wanted to propose a different way of thinking about cognition, where cognition is, as we called it, sense-making. It is the enacting of a meaningful environment through embodied action. So environment and mind are co-emergent and mutually specify each other. So what I want to do is share with you some ideas and illustrate them. Ideas from the Inactive Approach. And there are really four central ideas that I want to concentrate on tonight. I'm going to go through these in some detail, but so that you see them up front, I want to say some things about autonomy, which I'm going to mean in a particular way, which will become apparent. I want to say something relating that to emergence, and emergence is something that's already come up in John Protreppi's talk. I want to say something about this notion of sense-making, and I want to end with some remarks about embodiment. So let's begin then with the notion of autonomy. So let's start with an environment in which there are differentiated heterogeneous elements or processes that interact with each other in various ways. So the blobs represent processes and the arrows represent conditioning relations, where one conditions or affects the other. Usually, the way a system is thought of is that we draw some boundary around something that stands out and is of interest to us, and that appears to exhibit some kind of causal interconnectedness. So the classical example, when we say the physics of dynamical systems theory, is the solar system, the planets and their movement around the sun. So that's a normal way of defining a system. But for certain types of processes that we can observe, we can see that the interactions take on a particular form or have a particular form or particular pattern. So upon observation, we may discover that for certain elements, the conditioning arrows form a kind of closed network. That is a kind of interconnected network where everything in some sense eventually conditions everything else. And so there's a kind of operationally or organizationally closed system. It's not closed in the sense of being not open to the environment, because of course there is a conditioning relationship with the environment. But the idea is that there's a certain kind of bootstrapping or interconnectedness that makes something, in a sense I want to specify, generate its own identity, and in doing so, co-specify an environment in the sense of a meaningful place or region, if you like, for that particular pattern of connectedness. And this is what I mean by autonomy then, is this kind of self-emergent or self-generating system. So more precisely then, just to give you a kind of, philosophers like these sort of more precise descriptions, an autonomous system is one that's made up of processes, and they take a particular form. They form, as I said, a closed network, not materially or energetically closed. On the contrary, it has to be materially and energetically open, but closed in the sense that the enabling conditions for any process in this network or in this system always includes other processes in the system. Because of that, there's the generation and maintenance or sustaining of an identity in precarious conditions, in a shifting, changing environment, in an environment that's subject to entropy and the laws of thermodynamics. And this generating and sustaining of an identity also brings forth an environment in the biological sense of a niche, or to use von Exkel's term, an Umwelt, a world of relevance for the animal, if we're thinking of perceiving and acting animals. And I'll say more about animal life a little bit later on. Okay, so to illustrate this, let's take a kind of paradigmatic case. And this is the case of the living cell. You can think of this as a kind of schematic rendering of basic processes that make up a simple cell like a bacterium. So in this paradigm case of autopoiesis, autopoiesis means self-producing. And it was a term introduced to characterize this minimal, you could say, minimal biological form of autonomy. What we have is, inside the cell, a reaction network, a metabolic reaction network of enzymes and catalysis, autocatalysis, and so on, that produces a number of different molecular components that determine or constitute a bounded system, so this is in the form of a semi-permeable membrane, that houses and generates that very network. So there's a kind of closure in the sense that we have this interlocking of processes where we have the internal reaction network regenerating its own components, which includes regenerating the boundary, which makes possible this very network because it provides a kind of protected intracellular environment. And of course, in all living cells that we know on Earth, this is subject to the very precise interactions of amino acids and nucleic acids. Okay, so this is meant to illustrate the basic fundamental form then of biological autonomy. And autopoiesis is is a notion that was introduced, a concept that was introduced by Francisco Varela and his mentor, Humberto Maturana. Okay, so that's meant to give you some flavor of the notion of autonomy. And I think you can already see how this notion relates to the notion of emergence. Because in these systems, precisely what we see is a certain kind of emergence. The emergence of a system that has a certain identity and is related to the environment, in a way brings forth an environment that's relevant to it in a precise way. So emergence then, an emergent process, is this co-definition of system and environment. We have local interactions that give rise to a global pattern. So the cell is a kind of global dynamic pattern produced by these local molecular interactions. But it's not simply a bottom-up story. There's, as it were, the top-down side to it as well, because the global pattern constrains and regulates the local interactions. The local interactions happen in the way that they do because they are in this context created by the global pattern. And the images that we saw of the hurricane provide a very dramatic example of this, or of a tornado, where a tornado is a huge pattern of interacting air and water molecules, but the individual air and water molecules are doing what they're doing because they're sucked into this global pattern. So there's a kind of top-down, bottom-up dialogue that's the basis for the identity of this pattern that we call a tornado, or that we call a hurricane, or that we call a living cell, or that we call a human society, perhaps, or that we may call a biome or a region. These would be questions as to whether we can take these kinds of concepts and use them in informative ways for thinking about place and region and biome. And in that context, it's worth noting that emergence also generates nested hierarchies, where you can have emergent systems arising out of emergent systems, but conditioning them in turn. The multicellular organism is an example of this, where the individual cells are subject to their own autopoiesis, their own self-production, but the way that they do it is completely conditioned by how they talk to each other in the context of a multicellular animal with an immune system and a nervous system and an endocrine system, all creating their own kind of emergent patterns that make up the kind of beings that we are. Okay, so that's meant to illustrate what I mean by emergence. So what I would like to do now is to relate these ideas to the notion of sense-making. So in order to do that, let's go back to autonomy again. Autonomy as a process, it's very important to think of it as a process, not as something static, as a dynamic process. It defines a unity, for example, the cell, and what I would like to call a kind of norm. What's the norm? The norm is maintaining and enhancing that unity in precarious conditions. So the cell does what it does in its encounters with the environment, subject to the absolute norm of having to keep itself going. And also subject to the norm of acting or operating so as to improve its viability or its conditions of life. And interaction with the world in adaptive systems in particular, but even bacteria qualify as adaptive in this sense. Interaction with the world is monitored from the perspective of that unity and regulated by this norm. Because of this, the world becomes a place of significance and valence for the system. And that's really what I mean by an environment as distinct from a world. World, in the way that I'm using the term world, we can put on the lenses of the physicist and look out at the world and describe it physically. When we do that, we won't be able to talk about the significance that certain physical events have for the system, for the living cell, because of the way it's put together and the way its identity emerges. So certain things in the world become significant. The cell will approach or avoid them. They have therefore a kind of attraction, repulsion, valence. And that makes the immediate surroundings of the cell an environment and not simply a world. And sense-making is behavior or conduct that is attuned to that environment, that is flexible and adaptive and relates to the world not as an indifferent world as described by physics, but as a place of significance and valence, as an environment. And we see this even in the most so-called simple living systems like bacteria, motile bacteria, that move along chemical gradients. So if you have observed motile bacteria like E. coli in a gradient of sucrose, the bacterium will tumble about until it hits upon an orientation in which the sucrose gradient increases and it starts to swim up gradient because it has receptors at the membrane surface that can take up the sucrose and use it metabolically to move the flagella in a coordinated motion that propels it along the gradient. So sucrose, just looked at from the point of view of physics, is just another chemical. But given this particular structure and organization of the bacterium, sucrose is something significant and something that has a valence in the sense of something that is attractive that the organism moves toward, whereas other things would have a negative valence or repulsion, a movement would propel a movement away. So I'd like to relate this to something that the phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty said in his very first work, The Structure of Behavior. He wrote that he's talking about the nature of life and its relationship to mind and to the physical. And he wrote that each organism, in the presence of a given milieu, has its optimal conditions of activity and its proper manner of realizing equilibrium. A living organism modifies its milieu according to the internal norms of its activity. So an organism modifies the world into an environment according to its structure and organization that creates a certain kind of normative framework, so that its world becomes a meaningful environment. All right, so that, in the most basic biological form, is meant to illustrate something of what's meant by sense-making, a kind of conduct that's attuned to the environment or to place as an environment rather than just an indifferent medium. So again, it's not as if you parachute into a world that's already there and maybe you learn to get around because you have a good map in your head. Rather, the environment is what it is in part because of how you're put together and because of what you can do in that setting. Okay, so I'd like to relate this to embodiment by way of asking, well, what does the nervous system add? If we think of this in terms of biological evolution from single-celled organisms to metazoan organisms, where the cells that make up the multicellular body are interconnected thanks to special types of cells that have these long projections, which are the neurons. So, first of all, let's just go back to our simpler case. What we've already seen is a process of self-generation or self-constitution in coupling with an environment, or in coupling with the world such that an environment is also brought forth. And when the system has a certain kind of adaptivity, it's able to monitor and regulate its interactions, which we see even in the simplest organisms like bacteria, there is a kind of agency, we could say. There is in the case of the motile bacteria again, there's a kind of self-organized movement. So in the context of the nervous system, what the nervous system does is basically complexifies that dramatically. We have the constitution of a new kind of identity or a new kind of selfhood that has to do with more complex anatomical structures or cellular structures, but also the creation of dynamic patterns of activity among these cells, the neurons, that are interconnected among themselves and with the rest of the body. So the nervous system makes movement possible in the animal form, and perception possible, and the linkage of perception and action. So it creates a kind of sensory-motor identity, or sensory-motor selfhood, we could say. So the autonomy, then, we're still in the domain of autonomy. We haven't left it at all. But the autonomy is a kind of neurocognitive autonomy in which we still have this closed kind of network, or network that turns back upon itself like a snake eating its tail, as we saw in the autopoiesis case. But now it takes the form of there being assemblies of these special types of cells, neurons, that interact with each other. And they make possible the linkage of the sensory and the motor aspects of the organism, the sensors and the effectors, that enable the animal to move in its environment and to perceive in its environment. But that linkage is constantly modulating the dynamic activity of the nervous system that is generating these patterns that make possible the sensory motor activity. So again, we have this type of network that gives the system a kind of autonomy. If we then think of this in relationship to the environment, into what the perceptual psychologist Gibson called the animal environment system. Well, this side is what I just showed you in the previous slide. But now if we look at the sensory motor coupling with the environment that this makes possible, this affects the environment in terms of what Gibson called affordances. So the environment is the place where certain things in the environment afford certain things. They afford climbing up on, or they afford picking up, or they afford moving around. So the environment is meaningful in terms of what it affords the animal. And these affordances, collectively, as it were, constitute the niche, which affects the sensory motor coupling and influences its development, if we think of this in terms of the life history of an organism, for example, like a baby learning to walk. So this autonomy here should always be remembered in this broader context of coupling, forming the co-definition that makes up the animal environment system. Now, a really nice example of how this can give rise to different environments, different niches, different meaningful domains of interaction with the world is color vision. And this is something that I've worked on a fair bit some years ago. Different kinds of animal species have different types of color vision. Now, in our case, human color vision, belonging to the primate lineage, a simple way to think of it is that if you see renderings of the so-called color space, where you have a dimension of hue and saturation and lightness, so a three-dimensional color sphere, we can represent all of the colors that we human beings can discriminate in this kind of three-dimensional space. In the case of the honeybee, we can also do that. The color vision is three-dimensional in that sense, but it's shifted towards an aspect of the environment that we can't see, namely the ultraviolet region. So the whole three-dimensional space has the color space, as it were, has a three-dimensional structure like ours, but it's shifted down into the lower end of the spectrum so that honeybees can see ultraviolet patterns on flowers, which we aren't able to discriminate. In the case of the bird, the pigeon, and also fish like goldfish, the color vision system is actually more complex than ours in the sense that if you wanted to geometrically represent the colors and the ways that they can combine, you would have to move out of 3 dimensions into 4. So it's as if there's sort of novel primary colors that make up the color space of the goldfish in its aquatic environment. And in the case of the pigeon, it would probably be 5 dimensions rather than 4, with, again, novel colors and novel ways that those colors combine to make different shades. So this is a very beautiful illustration, I think, of the ways in which we all inhabit one world. The honeybee, the pigeon, the fish, the goldfish, and us. There's a sense in which we all inhabit the same world. But there's a sense in which we also inhabit different environments that overlap in some ways and don't overlap in others. And evolution is really about the drama of how these different organisms and environments emerge. And in the case of color vision, it's a particularly nice example because the ultraviolet patterns of reflectance on the flowers and also on the bird feathers have evolved or are there because there are animals to see them. And so there's a co-evolutionary story that you can tell about the environment and its physical characteristics and the organisms that inhabit that environment So again, it's not as if the environment is there, ready-made, and you sort of parachute into it, and you have a fancier retina, so you can see these patterns. Rather, there's a co-evolutionary history on the environment side that makes the environment the way that it is. Okay, so I would like to jump in our quick tour of some of these ideas to what happens in the social domain. In mammalian life, particularly among the so-called higher mammals, dolphins and chimpanzees and so on, but not restricted to them by any means, the self-constitution that we see thanks to the nervous system and the way that that is adaptive and regulates behavior in relation to the environment becomes complexified in the sense that there's a social dimension of coupling where multiple organisms interact with each other and change each other in their interactions. So we have the emergence of complex forms of coordinated interaction. And this is really what I mean by social cognition. So in this context, we're no longer really dealing with mere sense-making, as it were, but particularly now, in the case of say, bonobo chimpanzees and dolphins and human beings, we're dealing with a kind of participatory sense-making in social environments, where the sense-making changes itself thanks to the social dynamic. A lot of different examples of this can be given from human social cognitive neuroscience and social psychology and developmental psychology, from the sharing of emotion or affective resonance. It's a familiar phenomenon in nurseries that when one infant starts crying, other infants start crying, and you have a kind of, I don't like this term actually, but emotional contagion is the term that's used. I prefer to think of it as a kind of affective resonance. There's imitation and sensory motor matching, and this is a really nice example of that, where there's a coordination and matching of perception and action. You can think of this when you're walking with someone, a tendency to coordinate your walking with another person's. In neuroimaging, this has become a subject of great interest because it's been discovered that the patterns of neural activity involved in perceiving someone perform an action and generating that action yourself are similar, involve similar neural structures and similar patterns of activity, and similarly for the perception of an emotion in someone else and the generation of that emotion in oneself, that these areas of activation overlap considerably. So there's a sort of common format for self and other in the human brain and in the primate brain, for that matter. A lot of other different examples of this kind of participating sense-making that we could point to are from ethology. So this is a picture from Frans de Waal, who John mentioned. This is consolation behavior, where a juvenile chimp comforts or consoles an adult who's just been defeated in a fight. So the idea is that there's an understanding, an implicit understanding of the predicament of the other that's exemplified in this kind of consolation behavior. There's the phenomenon of shared attention or joint attention. This is an example that I particularly like, a painting by Rembrandt, where you have an object of attention, an object that's the shared attentional focus of these two individuals and the monkey, and the phenomenon is one in which there's an understanding of this object as what's being attended to by the group. So it's a kind of collective participatory interactive phenomenon that exemplifies what I mean by participatory sense-making. In developmental psychology, there is the phenomenon where human infants already at birth have an immediate sense of themselves of others as like themselves, and this can be seen in facial imitation studies. And then with the emergence of attentional abilities, and particularly at around the sort of 9-month period, the infant can come to understand herself as the object of attention of the caregiver. So it's not merely that the attention is there's an understanding of the attention as shared, say, on a toy, when the mother's eyes move to the toy and the baby's eyes also move to the toy, but the baby understands herself as what is being attended to by the mother. So there's a kind of reiteration of the perspective of another back onto oneself. And this is something, this phenomenon is something that was of particular interest to the phenomenological philosophers, and they talked about this under the heading of empathy. This goes back to the work of Edmund Husserl and his student Edith Stein, who wrote what I think is actually still the best philosophical work on empathy. It was published in 1916 on the problem of empathy, a doctoral dissertation with Husserl. And empathy in this context means the experience of the other, or of another, from the second person perspective, experiencing another as a living being or as a lived body, expressive of experience. And this includes, particularly as we just saw in the developmental context, being able to experience the other's experience of oneself. And that plays an essential role in making up one's own sense of self. One understands oneself as seen by others, and one's sense of self is tied to that intersubjective participatory sense-making. So I'm going to come to the end now. Let me remind you of where we began. We began with the idea of mind as a relational pattern, encompassing living beings and their environments, and therefore extending beyond the skull and the skin. And where we've arrived in this very quick tour of some of these ideas is that, and we knew this at the beginning, of course, that the relevant environment isn't only physical and ecological, it's also social. So mind is immanent not only in the ecosystem, but in the social environment. Human subjectivity is from the outset intersubjectivity, and no mind is an island. And I will stop there.